Roots, new art on stage.
Welcome everybody to the 26th edition of The Art of Assembly. This podcast is based on a live event at Oslo Black Box Theatre in the context of Ultima Contemporary Music Festival at November 30th, 2023. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm the host of The Art of Assembly. And The Art of Assembly is an ongoing nomadic series of lectures and conversations on the potential of gatherings in art, activism and politics. We have covered quite a bit of ground in the past editions, so if you're interested, you might want to check out our website with videos of all lectures and podcasts of all conversations, art-of-assembly.net. So in this series, we have talked about quite a wide range of the role of assemblies in art and activism, and what assemblies are, what theater, which is my background, plays in this, etc. So today, I would say we become quite specific in this research and looking at the impacts of sound and the sounds of impact. And this is a topic that we have touched upon in former editions once in a while, but never really looked at, never directly addressed also so far. So I'm very curious to hear a bit about how do acoustic spaces play a part in defining borders and creating communities. So while they fundamentally influence the shaping of public space, their ideological underpinnings, power structures, and implications are often unacknowledged. So that we all know that, but in a way, at least me, that is not so much into sound. Just take it as a given and don't really think about what is the role of this. So we want to investigate how reconfiguring sonic environments and practices might lead to new modes of listening and the questioning of cultural hegemonies. So I'm very happy to have 4 guests tonight, which is one more than we usually have. So we have quite a big program, and that's also why I will stop with this brief introduction and move on to first briefly introduce our guests, and later, when everybody's speaking, we'll tell a little bit more about them. So, in order of appearance, sound theorist Brandon LaBelle engages notions of social equality and acoustic justice, pointing out ways in which listening norms and conventions affect community building and social participation. Architect and musician Fabio Cervi discusses his work as assistant audio investigator at Earshot, an agency founded by artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan. And Earshot conducts sonic investigations for communities affected by corporate, state, and environmental injustice. Art journalist and DJ Atiyyah Khan digs up lost histories of how South African jazz musicians mobilized communities and unconventional venues during apartheid, creating spaces of political resistance and joy. And choreographer Xenia Koghilaki examines how crowd rituals and intensity in concerts and other musical situations unfold, and exploring collective movements as a means of resistance. Everybody will speak about 15-20 minutes, and then we will have time for a joint conversation. So thanks all for joining tonight, and I will introduce Brandon a little bit more as the first speaker. Brandon LaBelle is an artist, writer, and theorist living in Berlin. He's also the founder and artistic director of the Listening Biennial and the related Listening Academy. Your work focuses on questions of agency, community, and poetics, resulting in a range of collaborative and extra-institutional initiatives. In 1995, you founded Errant Bodies Press, an independent publishing project supporting work in sound art and studies, in performance and poetics, artistic research, and contemporary political thought. You have a lot of publications. I just mentioned the last ones, which include Dreamtime X, from 2022, Acoustic Justice from 21, and The Other Citizen from 2020. So every year one book. So I wonder which one comes this year. You will maybe tell us. Thanks so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Florian, and thank you very much for having me here. It's absolutely a pleasure to come and to participate in the Art of Assembly, and also to join the other speakers and undertake an open conversation, which I really look forward to. And I can say that the whole proposition of the art of assembly is quite something that resonates very much with my own practice. And I think, as Florian already indicated, somehow also thinking around questions of acoustics is something that's been on my mind for some years, but most recently around the concept of acoustic justice, which I've been exploring and proposing and also trying to practice in different contexts. So for this evening, I really wanted to take a little bit of time and just map out what do I mean by acoustic justice. So I'm going to just kind of give a conceptual overview of that notion, which I hope can also contribute to the conversation. So acoustic justice really has been a focus for myself as a researcher, as an artist, as a collaborator and educator. And I would say this is also very much bringing into focus a question of acoustics. So in a way, posing acoustics as a research framework. And in a way, trying to think around acoustics in terms of unpacking or challenging also some of the conventions or traditional ways of understanding acoustics. So this already can be understood by proposing thinking acoustics as a political issue or a kind of politicization of acoustics in terms of understanding how urgent and how important experiences of hearing and being heard are, especially the ways in which those things underpin processes of justice. So how vital hearing and being heard is to figuring and feeling oneself within a just society. So I would already say from the beginning that there's a fundamental acoustic question and acoustic politics at work in constructs of justice. So we can discuss that as we go. So to begin with, this can be thought on two levels. One being the question of social recognition. So how the ways in which we secure forms of participation and belonging, of course, for ourselves within society. So social recognition is very much shaped by the ways in which one may gain access to legal settings as well as institutional systems. So thinking around that as an issue of acoustics as well as justice, social recognition. In addition to that, I also want to think around what we could call social resonance. So not only to think about those forms of participation and belonging within more articulated forms of institutional experiences, but also thinking social resonance as the ways in which we also nurture and in a way need to also experience feelings of connection. So how and in what way do we nurture and secure that sense of connection to gain a sense of self-worth and vitality as being a member of a community? So social recognition and social resonance, these in a way for me become two fundamental sides to thinking around justice, and also the ways in which hearing and being heard are operative. So while acoustics is often understood as a professional practice, related, of course, to the physics of sound, and incorporated within projects of rather specialized architectures, I want to kind of shift in a way to think acoustics more as a daily practice. Acoustics is something that is very close to us, and maybe we might even think of ourselves as acousticians, yes, in the way that acoustics emerges or is articulated through those things that we do in order to enable the movement of a sound. Yeah. So to think acoustics as those things we do to support or even contest the movement of particular sounds. We might think about the circulation of voices and their meanings, for example. So what are the things that we do to support the movement and circulation of voices and their meanings, or also, of course, to challenge particular voices or meanings. So also I could say that working within the context of sound studies as a researcher, as an artist, sort of shifting to a focus on acoustics, as I'm already sort of mapping out, also affords an important shift, I would say, from concentrating on a sound or a sonic object, to think about that as a focus within sound studies. And instead, shifting to acoustics allows for addressing the conditions by which hearing and being heard takes place or is given place. So this includes, of course, expanding a focus on hearing as being tied to sound as well, thinking more broadly about hearing and, of course, listening as something that extends beyond the sound object as a sort of point of focus. And again, to think about the conditions around that sound. And of course, those conditions in which we are also situated as listeners. So acoustics is also about shifting from hearing and sound to listening and orientation. So to think more broadly or more contextually, even environmentally, through acoustics, I think helps us get at these broader perspectives around listening and orientation. Again, to sort of think more about what are those gestures, what are those arrangements, those systems that allow or that support and even nurture the emergence and circulation of particular sounds. And of course, therefore, particular ways of orienting ourselves around those sounds. And this, of course, also helps us think acoustics on the level of the body as well, as a kind of embodied social experience. And here, again, I think Florian is right in already sort of introducing the question of acoustics in a context such as this, or an assembly. Again, what are the arrangements we make in order to allow these voices to be present and to nurture particular meanings and conversations? So understanding acoustics then as a framework that is not only about sound, but rather the situations, the arrangements that allow for sounds to gain momentum and meaning, for hearing and being heard to also find support, and for ways of defining particular orientations. We can then already start to think acoustics, maybe following the notion of put forward by Yves Satan around the notion of ecologies of attention. So I'm really interested to think, again, acoustics as a daily practice that really tries to also craft ecologies of attention. Again, what are the things that we put into place? What are the relationalities that we involve ourselves in, that we give energy to, in order to craft and create conditions of attention, or, of course, as Satan says, ecologies of attention, which are kind of living ecosystems. And particularly for the author, this is put forward as a challenge to our contemporary attention economies today. Ecologies, as Satan argues, are supportive of attention understood as a giving rather than as a paying. So here this helps me elaborate acoustics, again, as a practice, as a political question, as a social, ecological issue. And again, here we might find further support by turning to the thinking of Jacques Rancière. And here we might pose acoustics then as the distribution of the herd, following Rancière's political theories. The distribution of the herd then, I think, can help us understand how I'm trying to position acoustics as impacting on the capacity for sounds to move, for voices to gain momentum, for particular forms of orientation to be performed. Here we might arrive at acoustics as a performativity, thinking acoustic performativity or acousticing, we can think as a practice, as those things we do to modulate the distribution of the herd, to dilate, interrupt, or retune a dominant tonality, if we think of the pitch of certain environments, to work at rhythms of synchronization as well as desynchronization, to engage the patterns and timings by which power expresses itself, to craft ecologies of attention through particular meanings so as to give them reverberation, to work at particular arrangements in support of certain orientations. So these are aspects of acoustic performativity that I want to think through. And here we might pose, again, two ways in which these can be thought to be operative. From the macro-political, thinking around the ways in which people rise up, demanding to be heard, and which often gains momentum through collective song or noise, as well as shared rhythms, to configure forms of synchronization with others that might also interrupt established patterns. From the macro-political to the micro-political, where individuals negotiate or modulate existing tonalities to retune their environments, how one may feel in certain places by way of the affective currents or sympathies shaping experience. So this kind of leads me to the formulation of acoustic justice, to think its position or impact on institutional as well as individual levels. If acoustics, as I'm suggesting, is deeply influential onto place and personhood, and what we can think of as social equality, it seems important then to argue for greater acoustic literacy. Acoustic literacy thought as a knowledge of acoustics, and which should be promoted, we might say. Acoustic literacy and understanding can positively help shape a range of environments. If we think of educational environments, if we think of learning situations, and also to legal or judicial contexts, not to mention daily environments from home to the street. These environments in which we can sort of approach as acoustic questions, environments in which struggles and also pleasures are found in terms of the sounds we encounter and the sounds we share that also help nurture particular orientations and ways of being together. So acoustic literacy as a knowledge of acoustic, I think, can help us in addressing somehow those urgencies, those necessities, those experiences. In fact, I tend to start to think acoustics as a form of social welfare, or what might even contribute to a commonwealth. We can think of the importance for giving room to the narrating of life stories, telling the story of oneself, as well as encountering the stories of others. To craft an ecology of attention might be to support the work of storying so vital to human flourishing. So here we might think more about acoustic care or acoustic welfare. The question then might be what gestures or arrangements can be made to enable the movement of particular sounds, especially when it comes to extending the arena of what or who is heard. And in what way do we care for acoustics, and in doing so care for the circulation of a diversity of views and voices, as well as the diversity of orientations, as what contributes to civil society. Here I can just finish by accenting also the ways in which listening as a focus participates in these issues or in the context of acoustic justice. So thinking also listening as a methodology within the context of acoustic literacy. How might we develop and expand modes of listening or understanding listening as multifaceted? There's maybe two sides I could pose or share with you in order to appreciate that a little bit more. One being the question of embodied listening, thinking around the somatic, to appreciate listening as central to a care of the self, a listening to and with the body. Listening here can be accentuated as vital to attending to the body as the basis for health and healing. And in addition to that, thinking around what we could call rhetorical listening, which is a question of how we can communicate, especially across scenes or sites of conflict. How to listen to those we disagree with. Here, we could say that listening is quite key to peace building and conflict resolution, enabling greater empathy and processes of sharing across social worlds. Listening as a diplomatic project. So both of these aspects, from embodied to rhetorical listening, from feeling to communication, are grounded in the essential power of listening. Listening as what can attend to localized experiences, to the immediate and direct encounter with others, in terms of addressing particular issues, communities, and struggles, while simultaneously allowing for a global view. Listening as what also affords greater understanding and therefore also opens a view toward a future to come. So at one and the same time, listening is here and there. It builds bridges between the specific and the common. So here, listening as a methodology, as a multifaceted experience or capacity seems quite central to the work of acoustic justice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think that's a very good base for the evening tonight, and we will talk later about it more. But first, I want to introduce Fabio Cervi, the second speaker tonight. Fabio is an architect, musician, and assistant audio investigator at Earshot, an agency founded by artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Earshot conducts sonic investigations for communities affected by corporate, state, and environmental injustice. So I don't need to go into details there because Fabio will give us an insight in a moment. You completed a master degree in architecture from the Royal Academy College of Art, where you explored 3D acoustics and environmental synthesis that employed pioneering technologies of sound visualization and virtual acoustic simulations. And with expertise spanning both architecture and music technology, you have further conducted specialized coursework in forensic audio enhancement at the University of Colorado. And I'm very happy you're here, and we will now, with this, start to look a little bit more concretely at different practices with the next speakers. Fabio, thanks a lot, and the stage is yours.
So our plan was to launch Earshot softly. We wanted to slowly introduce the world to the first not-for-profit organization using audio analysis and sound research dedicated to the fields of human rights and environmental advocacy. Our plan was a modest press release, expecting a few welcomes and fellow NGOs, and maybe a gig or two while we build our profile as any new organization would. Then the Al-Ahli hospital was hit in Gaza. Immediately after the blast, we got requests from Human Rights Watch and the Washington Post, and after we published our assessment, we were inundated with yet more requests. The BBC, Le Monde, CNN, Sky News, Amnesty International, Al Jazeera, the Financial Times, and the UNHRC. And just like that, we had officially launched into the world. Sound analysis in the field of open source investigation and human rights research was suddenly something everybody needed. It's as if all of the years open source intelligence has existed, half the story had been left untold in the soundtrack. Our analysis was based on the Doppler shift of the projectile that hit the hospital. The observed Doppler shift across two video recordings in distinct location significantly reduced the probability that the projectile that hit the hospital approached from the southwest, as the IDF had claimed, the Israeli Defense Forces. Our assessment went viral, not because we could use sound analysis to ascribe categorical blame in any direction, but because it presented a version of events distinct to what had been reported. The otherwise unconsidered sound of this event acted to strongly advocate for a more comprehensive investigation into all the evidence surrounding this attack, including full access to the site, munition fragments, as well as witness interviews. Sound here came to represent a stone unturned. While video records 30 frames per second, digital audio takes upwards of 44,100 samples per second. This means that in any given video capturing an event, there is always more sound than image to work with. Likewise, there are always more ear witnesses to events than there are direct eyewitnesses. Because of the omnidirectional way sound propagates through a scene or bleeds through walls, there is always more in earshot of an event than directly visible. There is so much we can learn from sound that is obstructed by walls or falls outside of the camera's frames, and in some instances even happens between the frames. While this quantitative point has always been the case, it seems a qualitative argument has prevailed. Seeing and images have long been privileged despite the abundance of sound. Eyewitnesses have always been treated as superior over those who simply heard an event. Seeing is still synonymous with believing, but we believe that there is a whole other way of seeing that listening allows. We're a core team of just 3 people, founder and director Lawrence Abu Hamdan, deputy director Kalin Matar, and myself. As Florian mentioned, I joined Earshot 1 year ago, having graduated with a master's in architecture from the Royal College of Art. And I have since conducted specialized coursework in audio forensics at the University of Colorado. So today I'm going to show you 2 published cases and 1 ongoing research project, showing the breadth of what we do and how sonic investigations can intervene in politics, journalism, and advocacy. Case study. Did the authorities announce themselves before entering? In a case of alleged excessive police force resulting in a citizen fatality, only the sound from a nearby CCTV camera captured this event. The victim was killed during a police entry, with conflicting accounts of whether he knew they were law enforcement. We received the audio and, using our profiling techniques, isolated the sound of a hydraulic door breacher, which is a machine used by the police to force doors open. That's that sound that you hear there. The motorized sound, distinct in frequency, preceded shouts after breaching. After the door had been breached, we could distinctly hear shouting, but no human voice was audible at the time of and leading up to the use of the hydraulic door. Did the breacher mask police announcements, or did they announce themselves at all? Once we effectively isolated and identified the sound, we set about to trying to answer this question and began by seeing how loud the breacher was in comparison to a human voice. Later in the same CCTV footage, we see and hear the same police officers using this machine to force entry to the victim's car, which is parked on the street outside the home. As they are using the breacher, two sounds are distinctly audible: the spoken and not shouted conversation between the police officers, overlaid onto the same sound of the hydraulic door breacher. Human voices were actually louder and occupied more space in the spectrum of frequency than the door breacher. We could then use this comparative analysis to support the witness accounts that the police did not announce themselves before forcing entry to the property. When we were approached to work on a case like this, we were when we were approached to work on a case like this, where the only sole evidence is sound, our partners have limited expectations on what can be done. We are often not tasked in answering specific requests, but rather asked to examine all the factors of a case and evaluating where sound can best intervene in uncovering what happened. There is not yet a cognizance of how sound can intervene in such situations, and in cases like this one, we are able to use sound analysis as a distinct category of evidence, that is, to answer questions that have yet not been asked. Case study: the killing of Nahel Merzouk. If there was ever a case which looked like it needed no audio analysis, it was this one. A teenager shot dead point blank by a police officer in broad daylight, captured on camera. The images were as clear as day, and yet the whole debate became about the 5 seconds of audio that preceded the fatal shot. Upon the request of our partners in France, Index, a not-for-profit investigative agency, we enhanced the audio recorded during the 5 seconds preceding the fatal shooting by a police officer during a traffic stop in Nanterre on June 27, 2023. Our audio enhancement revealed 2 distinct phrases. The first is a repeated command, coupe, cut. And the second intelligible phrase is pousse-toi, move over. News coverage attributed these to Nahel and the police respectively. Our acoustic analysis challenged this, suggesting all phrases were spoken by the police. If these 2 phrases had been spoken by different individuals facing in opposite directions, we would expect to observe a pronounced distinction in the way these phrases behaved across the frequency spectrum. This is because the 2 voices, one from inside the car, spoken away from the camera, and the other from outside the car directed towards the camera, would travel significantly different paths to reach the camera, resulting in audible differences. In this 3D simulation, we observe that most of the sound reaching the camera from inside the car, Nahel's position, is reflected off of obstacles in its path. Conversely, the sound reaching the camera from the voice spoken outside the car, the police officer's position, propagates directly from the police's position to the microphone. In this case, the acoustic behavior of these phrases would significantly differ in high frequencies. The voice outside the car should be louder and more intense in these frequencies, and we should observe a faster decay rate than the phrase allegedly spoken from inside the car. These spectrographs represent the intensity of each audible frequency across both phrases. The two phrases exhibit a markedly similar pattern. Neither phrase is more or less intense in the frequencies that will be affected by direction, resonance, and sound reflection from the source to the camera. From this analysis, we could conclude with a high degree of certainty that these two phrases were spoken by the same person or in the same acoustic condition. If the police officer was speaking to his colleague, it would strongly suggest that he was telling him to move out of the way before the gunfire, implying premeditation prior to Nahel moving the car forward. The analysis of the sound had brought us yet closer to an event that seemed so clear to the eye. Sound analysis opened up a whole new line of inquiry, adding a detail that significantly altered the sequence of events. Before listening to the sound, it was widely felt that the officer shot Nahel because he moved his car. But with the sound enhanced and made audible, we must now consider that Nahel may have known his life was in danger and moved his car as an attempt to survive. The Earshot team have just launched an ecoacoustic investigation in the Golan Heights that will demonstrate the environmental damage caused by the noise of 30 wind turbines. Our investigation is in collaboration with the local human rights organization Al-Marsad, who have been at the forefront of the battle against land and resource dispossession faced by this community for the past 20 years. European regulations stipulate that a wind turbine must be at least 2 kilometers away from the nearest residential development. In the Golan Heights, some turbines are planned to be erected as close as 35 meters to home, causing an unbearable amount of noise that effectively forces people off their land. Following the occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights in 1967, 340 villages, towns, and farms were destroyed, and most of the population was expelled and displaced. Today, 95% of this land has been given to illegal Israeli settlers, while the remaining population of 26,000 Jawlanis are restricted to 5% of the total annexed area. The wind farm project, initiated in 2019 through an agreement between Energix, an Israeli state-owned company, and the Israeli Ministry of Defense, is set to be built on the last piece of land owned by Golan Heights residents, depriving the community of their sole hope for future expansion. Standing at over 250 meters high, these turbines are more than twice the height of the average wind turbine. Apart from being significantly more visually imposing, these larger rotors produce more noise that propagates farther across the land. At 50 meters, this is what one of these wind turbines would sound like. Together with Jawlani sound artist Busher Kanj, our work will make up two interventions. One is to map the impact of the noise, arming local lawyers and activists with knowledge to contest this project. Two is to record as much of the sonic identity of the place as it is today, before the project commences, and the soundscape is forever altered. We aim to make these recordings accessible to all, serving as a repository of collective memory for the Golan Heights residents today and for future generations. Over the next years, wind will become an increasingly important point of focus, both as a source of energy in the place of fossil fuels and as a destructive byproduct of a warming planet. As evidenced by this work, we are already starting to see wind becoming an agent in the reorganization of social and political networks and territorial imagination. Sound here represents both the unwanted byproduct of wind and also a tool to rethink and resist incoming winds of dispossession. While the for-profit field of audio forensics has existed since the mid-80s, the tools needed for human rights research and environmental advocacy are completely different to those who do speech analysis for corporate law, or those who work fully with full access to privileged evidence, such as body cams, intercepted calls from state surveillance, or police radio recordings. Rather, our skills and our skill set is honed for handling challenging scenarios, shaky videos taken from a distance to ensure safety, lo-fi compressed audio with electromagnetic or radio interference, or, as in this last case I presented, sneaking in portable audio recordings and audio recording equipment to areas where it is prohibited by military occupation. Drawing from over a decade of working with citizen-documented sound, our approach is finely tuned to extract meaning from noise. Quite literally, at Earshot, we leverage electromagnetic interference as a vital tool for audio verification, aiding in locating and timing sources of sound. And rather than dismissing material with varying frame rates, uncalibrated microphones, handling noise, latencies, or recordings from considerable distance, our practices are tailored to embrace these conventionally unwanted elements. We've developed a methodology to read these imperfect signals, viewing them not as disadvantages, but as unique sources of information. For instance, echoes from recordings taken at a distance become invaluable in locating a shooter in a scene. Or latencies and delays between recordings help us triangulate events and reconstruct their timelines. While professional sound studios might disregard recordings with perceived quality issues, our work begins precisely where theirs might end. When confronted with amateur recordings captured hastily and in fear, especially in documenting crimes by state actors, human rights require more than just sound analysis. It demands distinct and novel ways of listening. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot. It's always impressive again to see what you managed to find out. Our next speaker is Atiyyah Khan, an art journalist, activist, DJ, and sound archivist from Johannesburg, based in Cape Town. For the last 15 years, your work on art and culture has been published in major publications in South Africa and abroad. Common themes in your work focus on topics like spatial injustice, untold stories of apartheid, jazz history, and underground art movements. You're also the co-founder of the music collective Future Nostalgia, which since 2013 has hosted listening sessions and gigs around South Africa. As a DJ, your sets explore music beyond boundaries, forming connections that connect South African sounds to the rest of the world. Most recently, you hosted a monthly show on Worldwide FM and currently run a short monthly show called on J-Wave in Japan. And before I forget it to mention later, you will also respond with a musical set to issues addressed in your talk later on in the foyer. But before this, we are happy to have you as a speaker, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for... Oh, is this working? Is that okay? Thank you so much. I'm just going to grab this water. So, as mentioned, a lot of what I'll be talking about today, I just have this one image. I don't have a presentation, but I feel like this image says everything. It is an image from a South African photographer who was very prominent under apartheid, called Umar Bacha, and this is taken in 1985 at a protest march by musicians in Durban, outside a jazz club. So I think the first thing to mention is to talk about that jazz in South Africa has always been connected to this idea of protest. And specifically because it connected people through freedom, through the idea of thought, and also through racial integration. And essentially, for many who don't know much about South African jazz or South African history, or many don't know much about apartheid, it's important to note that the struggle the struggle for freedom was actually pushed further by the jazz musicians in the community. So just to go back a bit, in the 1950s, the apartheid government issued the Group Areas Act, which was a way to racially segregate communities into different ethnicities. Prior to that, you had certain communities that allowed mixing. There was a lot of music, there were gatherings, races of different kinds would come together and hang out. And there were certain very vibrant communities where jazz was already, having filtered through the US and having connected with traditional sounds was already happening, like through the records coming through and fusing with traditional African sounds. So this situation in the 1950s, where people were forcibly removed to different areas, where communities were torn apart, suddenly it became a huge clampdown on essentially the way culture was expressed. So firstly, musicians could not move and perform with different artists of different races. And within the jazz community itself, this became a huge issue because suddenly, how were people supposed to play? So going back to the topic around acoustic spaces creating communities, essentially the jazz musicians were pivotal in creating communities. It was, I could argue that it was jazz as a form, but it was actually the people behind it that pushed very hard to make sure these communities were created against, risking their lives, risking jail time, and all of these things. So I think firstly to understand what came with the Group Areas Act was also this idea of pass laws. So when people speak about what defined apartheid, it was like, in order to go from one suburb to the next, everybody needed to carry a pass that was checked at a checkpoint. And so musicians, actually, if you had a gig in another area and you didn't have a pass, you couldn't go. But this only applied to the racial categories who were considered non-white, i.e. native, colored, or Indian, whereas white musicians were allowed free rein to play wherever and do whatever they wanted to, and play in different communities. So we have a quote here from Abdullah Ibrahim from 1979, although that's quite late already, where he says, it's illegal for blacks and whites to play together. You have to have a permit to play for Indian people, for white people, but you're mainly restricted to your own community. But Abdullah Ibrahim was formerly known as Dollar Brand, and he lived in exile for many years. And that's also another element to the story, is about how musicians who were able to move somehow managed to get out of South Africa and go to different communities. So just to say that, aside from the pass laws which stopped them from performing, with each other, and so essentially jazz in South Africa has a legacy of musicians breaking the rules and, just deciding to do, play with each other regardless. But record labels would not pay black musicians royalties. This is common with a lot of British colonies where certain black musicians had to play behind a curtain. So the white musicians were on stage and then the black artists were playing behind a curtain. And sometimes their names were changed to sound more European or to sound like they were white musicians. So there was a lot of violence enacted upon musicians, and this was not that long ago. And a lot of these wrongs have not really been spoken about. They've not really been corrected. It's not really public knowledge what musicians endured. And that's why it's important to tell these stories. So as apartheid got more and more between the 50s, the 60s, what started to happen was certain communities endured forced removals. So areas that were very thriving, like District 6, like Sophia Town, which had strong community bonds. Like this, if you come to South Africa now, you will definitely go to certain places where people will be like, okay, you can see what happened in District 6. This is what it used to be like. This is what it looks like now. This is when the bulldozers came. This is what they did to erase culture and to erase identity. So the apartheid government was incredibly smart. I mean, sometimes I have to still commend them for the genius plan they put in place, which is still very much, which can still very much be seen right now. I mean, it really wasn't that long ago. And you can still tell that these roots go quite deep. And with us as young people, we're still enduring the repercussions of these systems. But one of the things that they did was try to remove a sense of identity and try to divide all kinds of people. So what did the musicians do? How did they then survive? One of the things that happened is that shebeens, which are like informal bars in their particular areas, became places of gathering. Instead of hosting things at venues, because all the venues were suddenly shut down, like during the 70s, many venues shut down. They decided to have these informal bar situations where traditional beer was being made by like women, and it seemed like just casual gathering spots, but actually it was where the musicians would gather to play, or, if a raid was happening, then they had to kind of cover up, but at the same time as these musicians were gathering, so were political conversations happening. And so they were mixing with a lot of the activists, they were mixing with a lot of the freedom fighters, and these things were happening at parallels. So for instance, there's a story I wrote about a photographer who would cover a lot of anti-apartheid rallies, but also he's a big jazz fan. So he showed me his film reels from his camera, and you'd see on the negatives, there's like one morning, you've got like a rally somewhere at a campus somewhere, and then in the evening he's at the jazz gig in some part of town, and then the next day he's at like a rally or whatever. So these things were happening around the same time. There was a lot of mixing between the musicians, and also it showed in the music. So they might not have been making sounds that were on the nose, talking about the injustice, but certainly, especially like through some albums where there are no lyrics, there's something about certain compositions that became anti-apartheid struggle songs. And some of our best music in our history of South African jazz come from this time period. Another way that the apartheid government was incredibly violent was through something that was called Radio Bantu, which is something that the South African broadcasting, the national broadcaster, decided to enact by tribalizing different ethnic groups through sound. So what does that mean? If I'm Indian, well, actually, I don't even think this was around at the time, but traditional Zulu music for Zulu people, that's that station, and traditional Xhosa music for Xhosa people. And so they tried to make an apartheid sound project, which I think there still needs to be a lot more research in this field. I mean, there's a lot of academic research, but I would say that the majority of people are not aware about what happened with Radio Bantu, which is basically to create tribalized radio. And essentially, jazz was considered too highbrow. It was considered, too much thought. It was considered too powerful in its ability to rally people together. And so an easier project for the state was to create controlled sound. And because of the mining and the migration of workers through Johannesburg, they even made like cheap transistor radios so that they knew that the migrants would be picking up these radios so that they could, and they put up radio towers. So, you know, it was like a whole plan to try, and these radio stations from those times still exist now. They just, I don't think many people are aware of their history. So, for instance, this is a quote from a great book about South African jazz, which I highly recommend, from a writer called Gwen Ansell. The book is called Soweto Blues, and it says, but apartheid overlaid the word jazz with other more sinister connotations. Then under apartheid, the white authorities found it unacceptable that black musicians should be acknowledged as capable of playing such sophisticated music. And so symbolic annihilation became part of the hegemonic staging and broadcasting of jazz. Playing behind a screen at the Cape Town City Hall while a white musician mimed his notes, Reedman Winston Mankunku Ngozi was billed as Winston Man. In radio broadcasts, pianist Tony Shoulder heard himself rechristened Peter Evans, and trumpeter Johnny McCowa became Johnny Keane. So for those that somehow were, for those core musicians, I mean, I think globally, within the international perspective, what South African jazz is, people know about figures like Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, Abdullah Ibrahim, and the Blue Notes. Those were four, I would say, like four key bands or figures that managed to, through their tours of London, Europe, New York, they managed to create a kind of global community resistance around South African, what was happening under apartheid. They managed to mobilize, but they were often in the same company of writers, photographers, journalists, activists, politicians, and they were kind of like banded together wherever they were internationally, unable to return home, but continuing the message forward. So just to note that the exile community is sometimes considered lucky for being able to get out. And yes, a lot of the local musicians were entirely dehumanized through the process of still performing, but that there were a lot of, as the 70s kind of continued and the resistance movement started growing because, you know, apartheid ended in the 90s, there was a state of emergency in 1985, which is when this photo was taken. So aside from the shebeens, where else did they gather? They gathered everywhere. Funerals included protest poets and musicians. There were cinema houses that would have musicians perform at, and anywhere which could basically hold a public gathering doubled up as an event, which also doubled up as a rally. So for instance, later in my set, what I'm going to be doing is displaying the album covers of everything that I play, which is something that's part of the collective that I'm in, which is, you know, trying to, I don't know, destabilize this idea of what a DJ is and this inaccessibility of what they're playing. So please feel free to come up, look at the album covers, examine it, study the liner notes, you know, don't be shy. But one of the songs that I'm going to be playing is a track called Manenberg, which refers to an area in Cape Town by Abdullah Ibrahim. And that song, it's funny because it became like a hit. It's a very catchy tune. You can hum it very easily. But it was also an anthem at political rallies. It somehow became very popular and was performed at multiple rallies throughout the country and even beyond the borders of South Africa and moved through Zimbabwe and all of that. So essentially, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about does relate to what I'm going to be playing, but because of the time situation now, I didn't include it now. Yeah, I think that bringing it back to the conversation of now, what we have is an idea that musicians took on political roles as activists. I don't think in any other music scene in South Africa do you have this kind of thing happening. There were some pop musicians who had cultural boycotts. there were certain artists who did speak out, but mostly the musicians were physically risking their lives to be in mixed race bands, to be in each other's areas illegally, to be caught by the police, to go past the curfew. There was a curfew of 10 o'clock, and there's like some songs that allude to like the 10 p.m. curfew that they had to endure. So I think that it's very important to note that specifically one of our legacies of apartheid is also to say that jazz musicians were very instrumental in fighting back. They were very instrumental in making sure people gathered, in making sure important conversations happened, but, you know, often disguising it, because any kind of trace of mobilization, people were arrested immediately, tortured, maybe, you know, thrown down the stairs, pushed off a building, who knows what happens. So they were really risking their lives in this moment. There was a lot that happened that hasn't really been spoken about. And that goes for theater also, that goes for different, you know, you will find, I have a record with me here by a band called The Genuines, and you'll find that there's a sticker at the back of the album, I kind of point it out when I'm playing. There's a sticker at the back of the album where there's a line through the songs that are like the most politically inclined, basically. So that's from the South African national broadcaster. Of course, they used to sometimes scratch the records with a pen. If anything was deemed too political, they would just like damage the songs, and sometimes that was the only copy of records. A lot of records were banned. But it was very important to note that sometimes the message wasn't, we oppose apartheid, we are fighting for our freedom. It was very subtle. It was coded. It was very underground. Sometimes there were no words, but it was in the spirit of the sound of what they were creating. So somehow to get a playlist of this music that takes you through that time, you can almost feel what was happening. And to go back to someone like Abdullah Ibrahim, but also the Blue Notes, who I'm not sure if they toured in Norway, but they toured extensively through Sweden, Denmark, London. They lived in London, and Johnny Diani was one of the members. All of the members besides one passed away in exile, and that's often the tragic story of what happened to these musicians, is that they left, they weren't allowed back, they spent their whole lives fighting for freedom, playing for freedom, and they couldn't make it back to see, you know, the fruits of that. And so I'm quite close to basically the only remaining member, who's very elderly and, you know, tells me a lot of stories about these travels and what they did. But the Blue Notes are very important because they were playing some very avant-garde, very free jazz. And I don't think there was any band around at the time doing what they were doing. They had Chris McGregor was a pianist, and he was the only white member. So I found this earlier today. I'm not sure. It's supposed to be a quote by Louis Moholo saying, sometimes Chris McGregor would have to play behind a curtain and vice versa. I think he's talking about when they were still in South Africa, because they left in the 60s and that was it. So basically he's saying in this quote that Chris used to come to this place where we would sometimes drink beer in the Zulu quarters, but white people were not allowed here. He would paint his face with black polish to come in. So I think they were all about like between the ages of 16 and 21 or something. They were still very young when they left and basically did not return. But the point about that is to say that what they were doing, from the naming of their songs, from the language that they sang in, Abdullah Ibrahim or Dollar Brand is a really good example. They were asserting and affirming an African identity in a time when the white supremacist government was basically saying black folks or brown folks or people of color have no identity. They have no heritage, they have nothing. And it was a completely dehumanizing project. So this is part of my ongoing work. I've written extensively about this topic. I've done radio shows, got many playlists around it. And I think when the talk goes online, there will be some resources to add to that, because this is just a little bit of a brief summary. But just in terms of the topic of acoustic spaces and how that helped to build community, I guess against all odds, is why I chose to talk about this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, actually on the website you sent already several links, so you can also do homework with some articles and a lot of listening to radio shows and other things that you already find there. So our last speaker for tonight is Xenia Koghilaki. Xenia works in the field of performing arts as a dancer and choreographer, and you hold an MA in solo dance authorship from the Berlin University of Arts and have previously studied dance and architecture in Greece. So already two architects, which may be also with the topic of sound that we're involved today is not by chance. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. In your work, you put the body in the center of your research interest, exploring concepts of collectivity and embodiment in relation to dance and choreography, while your practice focuses on challenging the triptych power, knowledge, and body. I'm happy you're here, and the stage is yours.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in today's event. Today, I would like to discuss on rituals and practices that arise within musical spaces, reflecting on the social and political significance of dance as a physical resistant practice. Concerts and music spaces often serve as platforms where bodies, moved by shared musical appreciations, come together and collectively express emotions, participating in a common ritual. Seen as such, the dance that is immersed in such spaces, both as a social practice and as a concept, provides complex experiences of being together. In these terms, the dancing crowd of a musical event is a living and breathing entity, a kinetic realm where bodies sway, spin, and pulse in synchronicity. It's a realm where the boundaries between bodies dissolve and the shared language of movement emerges. However, talking about the dancing crowd and being together in synchronicity, I would like to point out the observation of the philosopher and theater scholar Kai van Ekels, who observes that calling for collectivity under the spectrum of pleasure can have violent impacts in terms of exclusions and inclusions imposed to the individual's convenience. More precisely, he observes that in activities like joining a party, a singing, or a dancing, collective identity can be presented in forms of objectivated regularities, along with authoritative statements like, "That's how we do things around here." Reflecting on the relation between music and dance, it's interesting to compare this observation with the levelization and the equalization of the beat logic that is suggested in Western club electronic dance music, referring to the beat as a tempo, a specific rhythm that acts as a regular unit of time. In connection to this, and looking into the role of the body in mass theory, I would like to bring into the discussion the concept of the discharge. Discharge is an action that comes after a state of waiting. It transforms a group of people who happen for entirely accidental reasons to be together into something that finds some sort of communality. An example of a discharge can be the action of applause of a group of people who constitute an audience of a performance. Following this, I focus my attention to the idea of discharge as a redeem of anticipation, of longing for something. For the philosopher, researcher, and author of Unworking Choreography, The Notion of the Work in Dance, Frédéric Pouillot, gestures of discharge, as for example the applause, are the delayed indication of a hope in its ultimate and disappointed substitute. And with this presentation, today I would like to reclaim the hope in movements of discharge using the practice of moshing as my case study and exploring this hypothesis from a dancer's perspective. Moshing is a hardcore practice of crowd dancing, usually associated with heavy metal and punk culture. It happens during live shows, in the center of the crowd, in the space called the mosh pit. It is energetic and full of body contact, and some of its variations are pogoing, stage diving, headbanging, wall of death, floor punching, and more. What is important for me in that point is that the practice of moshing arises within musical spaces, and thus it has a social dimension in the sense that it's developed and put to use by people who dance it. One can tell that the practice of moshing has never been part of my movement vocabulary, as I've never considered myself being part of punk or heavy metal culture. However, moshing as a practice creates for me a connotation of a community by default. In that sense, it's a practice of embodied discharge of different types of crowds. It works on the precondition that it is connected with specific events and thus situates itself in a context of collective memory. Practices of moshing belong mostly to musicians on stage and fans of punk and rock culture, but at the same time, the embodied and physical elements of such a practice have been informing different types of crowds throughout history, such as protesting, rebellious, reversal, but also religious and feasts crowds, among others. So either moshing as an action with which the state of a music is emphasized, or moshing as the use of the physical body for expressing dissent and reclaiming aliveness, it becomes for me a practice that relocates relationships in time and makes events slip across the years. I could say moshing is a memory, personal and cultural. And in that sense, it constitutes an endless chain of reciprocity and exchange of time, sweat, breathings, cultural and political particles between bodies, which is never, ever static. All the above encourages my initial decision to reflect on today's thematic from the perspective of space and bodies and bring in questions such as: how can music spaces offer the possibility for bodies to rehearse disruptive physicalities? How can music spaces allow the emergence of new intimacies between bodies? How can they allow alternative modalities of relation and new ways of moving both singularly and collectively? In the mosh pit, music binds the crowd together. It is important, however, to acknowledge that there is usually a political practice that goes with the mosh pit culture, and this is manifested in the way the live events are organized. For example, concerts of solidarity, DIY festivals in underground music venues, and occupied spaces. All these spaces that are felt more than thought give a certain quality to the materiality and the texture of the sound, and in consequence, to the experience of being together. Heavily distorted and amplified guitars, fast blast beats, aggressive vocals, the growling, lo-fi, the raw qualities, the grain, the sonic bleed between microphones placed close together when the threshold is high. All these create a sense of urgency, a necessity for loudness that emphasizes spontaneity and aliveness and affects the skin, the flesh, and the bones, as well as the physicality of the bodies. In the mosh pit, there is anger, dissent, and frustration. There are collisions, crashes, thrashing, and hits between bodies. There is touch. Personal space is invaded, allowing body-to-body interaction and physical contact. The act of pushing is used as the central strategy for dealing with corporeal and space negotiation. Bodies collectively release emotions and at the same time spontaneously and playfully practice self-defense. Viewed from the outside, it seems like a merely aggressive and chaotic realm. However, there are unwritten rules that prevent the pit from degenerating into an actual chaos. For example, if someone falls, directly several hands will help them up. Or in stage diving, when someone courageously jumps off the stage in a parallel to the floor position and the crowd catches them up and travels them all around the space. The same with crowd surfing. Crowd surfers trust that the mosh pit will keep them afloat and allow their bodies to release their weight to the crowd. Or finally, the wall of death. This is typically constructed when the band splits up the crowd into two opposing groups facing each other. The band countdowns and then signals to the crowd, indicating that each side can run at each other at a furious speed until collision. In all the above, there is at the same time violence and trust, brutality and tenderness, rawness and sensitivity in terms of release of weight, falling, standing up and falling again, running and jumping up and down. Seen in these terms, moshing can be reflected not only as a state of extreme dancing, but also as an embodied collective ritual of trust, a cooperative space that gives light to gestures of solidarity, embodied collective reflexes of support, mechanisms of space negotiation. It can be explored as a moment in and out of time, a state in which normative physicalities are put into question, a site of collective struggle that intersects various dichotomies and reminds that today bodies heavily surveyed, brutalized by authoritative states, physical and political, are under attack. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. This was a lot of input, and I don't think I will find the one question that I can address collectively to all of you because it's quite a range. But of course, I was thinking about like where there are bridges, and I think there are some of them obviously are. I mean, I find it interesting, as we already mentioned, that the spatial question is relevant to everything what you talked about. There's obviously a question of the social construction that is behind it. So in a way, from the concept of acoustic justice, where the work using acoustic evidence to help justice prevail, via questioning the role, how music can politicize but also create alliances, to the concept of social cooperation that you used in to describe it's something that happens in the mosh pit. So there's some ground to it, but maybe I will start with something that I became very clear in the last talk with Xenia, when you focus on the body, on the bodily impact, and you don't use the question of or the construction or the detour of storytelling and narration in a way. And and you, Fabio, describe a practice where you use the sound to get to a story, to a narration, to a truth in a way, and to bring, maybe start with you, Brandon, to bring you, since you were the first, to bring your voice into it. I find it interesting that in your talk, you talk a lot about listening, also in a semantic sense, in storytelling, listen to stories, listen to that, and maybe you could stress a bit to in a way bridge to Xenia the role of bodily experience in this, because I think you focused on something else a little bit in talks, and maybe you can talk a bit about the role of bodily presence and maybe other more immediate aspects of acoustics and sound that don't go via storytelling.
Okay. Yes, no, thank you, Florian. And yes, I think this notion that I make a sort of allusion to about the somatic is definitely very key and very essential in terms of how I'm thinking around acoustics, acoustic justice, questions of listening and community. And one of the aspects maybe that I could share that I've been kind of delving into more recently is really looking into healthcare, nursing practices, body work, somatic practice. And along with that, there's often a very strong reference to listening. Listening is often called upon in those contexts to perform a really vital task, which is to say how listening enables one to attune to the body, to stay in touch with the body. And in this way, I've been very curious to think about the body as an inner acoustic. If there's a way in which one listens to oneself, then somehow or another we're calling upon the body or positioning it acoustically, somehow in my sense of it. So the way, even in terms of self-talk, in terms of inner voicing, if we think about self-reflection, already a kind of acoustic image of reflection. So there's a sense in which we throw the voice into ourselves, back into ourselves, suggesting a kind of acoustic reflection sort of that takes place in a way that allows us to hear our bodies, yes, to attend to them, and therefore then to kind of nurture and take care of what the body tells us. So I think there is a very dynamic and fundamental way in which listening is an embodiment, is a gesture or practice of embodiment. And, from starting from there, it kind of opens up a lot of interesting practices and methodologies. For instance, we can also, focus on traditions of meditation and different wisdom traditions, different spiritual practices in which listening is very key to also hearing those voices that are also ancestral, that are spiritual voices, that are planetary voices. They're the ways in which the body carries all these other stories, but in a way, make of them kind of physical knowledges. So this is something that, I think is very strong and very dynamic. But again, I like this notion, if we could follow it, of turning acoustics inwardly.
Often I get a bit nervous when dancers and choreographers speak about somatic experiences and practices because it becomes very difficult to grasp, at least for me. So listening to your talks, I thought that acoustics might also be a way of bridging this gap. Fabio, in your practice, you separate the sound from the image, and the image is already separated from the physical space. So my first question is, do you always work with digital material, with digitalized forms of the space? Or do you also research in the concrete physical space, if it is possible? And also that the body becomes strangely absent in your investigation, even though it is always about violence towards this body. So maybe you could also say something about that.
That came to mind, the body is central in all these investigations because what appears in each investigation is that what we're listening to is subjective in every case. You are not hearing the sound of the whole event. You are hearing the sound from a perspective in space that has absorbed the conditions and the acoustics of whatever space it's in from that position. So there's this notion of truth and objective and subjective truth, and when it comes to sound investigations, it's all subjective. The information that we derive from certain locations is different from if it were to happen otherwise. So there's this process of reconstructing some form of objectivity from something that cannot be anything but subjective. And then the first question, like visual-wise, we usually do have some video component, just by nature of how we all have phones, and people, when they react to these kind of events, the easiest thing to do is to record with the video. So we always have the combination of video and sound. Oftentimes the video might be pointing in a completely different direction, so we only can work with the sound of an event. But even so, as I mentioned, there's a bit of a paradox, because there's more material to work with in the sound than in the video in any case, by just the nature of sample rates and frame rates.
Which is interesting. I was thinking about the work that Lawrence did with reconstructing a prison in Syria only from acoustics, which would be actually something where it was only by a description of people about the sounds they heard, because it's a prison where it's in complete darkness inside, and they are blindfolded and no windows and so on. So how then the space was actually recreated out of acoustic memories. You talked about jazz, and you very much talked about the social construction and a little bit about, and the role of the artist and their experience and the danger they put themselves in. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. Is there something for you in the genre of jazz that made it an obvious choice as a music? So why was it jazz and not another kind of music? Is there something, or could it have been another kind of music? So what is the role, what is the specificness of that, maybe? Also in relationship maybe to this super astonishing fact that the apartheid regime kind of tried to assign certain types of tribal music to certain groups, which in a way sounds like, okay, that could be also an archival project actually in terms of identity, but it was used in a way to divide. So maybe also in relationship to this idea of separating tribal music, what is the role of why jazz?
Okay, so basically I heard that Norway is really big on like what they call improv. And so I essentially improvised my entire talk, and has subsequently realized that there were whole chunks of it missing. So I'm really worried about this recording. But what I wanted to say was, also I couldn't see anyone. So it was really disconcerting. I was like, what am I seeing? So anyway,
you talk in the radio usually. Well, you should be used to that.
Yeah, but I was like, what? Like, I don't know if I was like. So I'm sorry if it didn't make sense. But what I wanted to say was, okay, firstly, so jazz in South Africa emerged out of the mixed race or black areas. So it comes out of the socialization of the working class, of the masses, and it's not necessarily something in the construction of the sound, but it's the communities that played it the most, i.e., like in South Africa, I didn't go through all the racial terms. We have black, colored, Indian, all kind of living very close to each other, and then the white areas are separate. But essentially, those communities were like they were so mixed together, and because jazz evolved out of the shebeens, it evolved out of the townships, it evolved out of backyard gatherings and all-night parties. One thing I forgot to mention was the joy that was there, is that it's so dark and it's so violent, but at the same time there was so much joy. And I think my generation, born out of the 80s, realizes that we get told that apartheid was black and white. Meanwhile, I don't mean like colorism of people, but I just mean like it was like this or it was like this. Meanwhile, through my research as a journalist, I'm realizing there were a lot of grays. There were a lot of gray areas, and there were lots of, for instance, young white women going into like the deepest township to go and hang out with the head of some nightclub, which was really amazing. Like all these, there were even laws against liquor that were sold at these venues. Like beer was considered for the masses, spirits were considered more highbrow and for white folks. Like everything was divided. So essentially why jazz is because jazz emerged as black music. Even in the world, it emerged as black music, and that's why it became a struggle for freedom from the people who were being oppressed, number one. And number two, just in terms of this Radio Bantu situation, like the tribalization of radio, from one perception, it was kind of seen as, you should be proud of your ethnic heritage. Here's all your music, but don't listen to anything else by anyone else. And what I'm saying about those roots being still effective is you have so many divisions in South Africa right now. Whenever anybody comes to visit, I say it's a highly divided, schizophrenic situation because you have too many identities, nothing that really unites anybody. Besides fake attempts at like a World Cup rugby or something, these false attempts at unification, but there really isn't anything, not even a language, not a single identity, nothing, as opposed to maybe several other African countries that might have that. So South Africa has its own situation, which is quite odd. But the tribalization of ethnic identities was in relation to the fact that jazz was banned and there was no space for it. And then another story that I didn't mention was that something else came out in combat of that called Radio Freedom. So to combat Radio Bantu was Radio Freedom, which was actually moved as a Pan-African network through Zambia and through different countries, where they played all of this very intense jazz that was being made from the exiles and from the local community.
Then Xenia, I was wondering, because I already mentioned it, but you bring in the concept of, you talked about collective struggle also, and you in the introduction, and about social cooperation, and you quoted Kai van Eickels about certain dangers of collectivity. So if you would move out of your field study in a way that you said you did as an outsider to a degree, is there something, would you say there's something to learn, to understand about as a social practice that could be expanded, basically from the mosh pit to other circumstances? Or is the mosh pit a solution that could work in other contexts as well? Because you have a, let's say, legalized, in a way, maybe even safer space, even though it seems a bit contradictory, to enact certain needs and bodily desires, or aggression, and so on. So what would be how would it fit into a larger concept of social practices or society even?
I think what is important is the state of the body, that it. I'm searching for a word actually in English. Anyway, yes, the physicality of the body at that moment. That it's for me is what I say, the loud body, and it's in a state of urgency. It's somehow what I say, reclaim aliveness at that moment. But apart from that, what's also interesting is these reflexes of support of the crowd. And very typical example is this, that if someone falls, really there are hands that immediately will help them to stand up. So these unwritten rules that they are also called the pit etiquette, that bodies follow to protect each other, but also to visit this state of urgency. For me, it's something that it's interesting, movement-wise, choreographically-wise, but also something that it can be put out of the context and practiced generally.
One thing that comes to mind listening to your talks is the concept of the archive. Atiyyah, you very obviously work with an archive, and
Fabio, you mentioned that you are archiving sounds at the Golan Heights, sounds that might not exist anymore in the future. And you, Bentley, you talked about sonic or acoustic literacy, which also requires some kind of memory, some acoustic memories, and might be actually connected to the idea of the archive. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so just to say that, like, without being trained as an archivist, I think through the process of being a DJ and as a journalist, it pushes you to do that, especially with collecting records, most of which our albums from South African musicians are sitting in Europe and London and the US, and it's absolutely not available to us, nor can we afford them. So for me, when I travel and I buy records, it's a process of creating the sound archive back home. It's a process of repatriating the albums so that they exist back home. But also, what's very important to understand is that South African, anything that was not white in terms of culture and cultural literacy was not really celebrated or written about. It was, in fact, either it was anything that made black folks, and I'm speaking broadly as black as a term of encompassing people of color as well, was either suppressed by mainstream media. It was not written about. It was censored. It was banned. So what does that mean? It means that there's like a 40-year gap of articles, of writing, of films. And recently there was an amazing movie from the 80s that wasn't really shown. It was banned. It was called Mapansula, based on like a dance movement from the 80s. A beautiful film shot in Johannesburg in the 80s that never really got to be shown on cinema. And now it's kind of being, it resurfaced for a film festival. And it's like so important to see ourselves being represented on screen because we were not given that privilege growing up. We did not have those stories. So one thing for me why sound archives become important is because some things don't exist in writing. They only exist through some kind of recorded sound material. So it's up to us to kind of like dig through, collect that material. Some of our most important artists we don't even have one interview of, for instance. So it's a long process of like restoring memory through these stories, through the sounds. So it's actually like the number one thing as part of a practice I'd love to learn more about also.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And I just, to share one perspective, recently I was part of a conversation in Lisbon around a project the city was initiating, focusing on collecting oral histories. Yes. So going through neighborhoods in the city, speaking to particularly older generations, recording them speaking about how the city used to be, telling stories, capturing this archive, quite traditionally of oral histories. And in the conversation, we started to really think, well, what about oral histories? So to think more about the histories of listening rather than histories of sound. So think less about sonic archives in terms of what are the things people heard, but how did people listen? To think about oral histories as really important as well. And so this is something that I'm very curious about. And have been quite interested to also look further into the project of archaeoacoustics in terms of like thinking around like archaeologies of acoustic spaces or the ways in which environments were acoustically shaped or experienced historically. So through archaeoacoustics to try to think about how did people hear or how did particular communities experience listening or approach, or even in a sense we could think about listening positionalities, right? So this is something a little bit on my mind that might contribute to the question of archives.
And also I would like also to orient it to the movement archive in relation to what we hear or what we listen and how our bodies create this genealogy of movement according to the spaces that we belong to or we don't belong or we are excluded, and what is what is the archive from the perspective of movement, just to...
And yeah, maybe if you go a bit so to answer the question, how would you answer the question that you just asked?
It comes from, of course, from my body, from where the context that I was and I am into. So in relation to my practice, I usually work with the genealogy of movement that I carry on as what I am today. However, I also think that there is an interesting point in this collective archive of bodies. So also moshing, for example, that I bring in, I say that I've never been part of this culture, but I had a lot of friends. I was, when I was a student, visiting a lot of spaces, and I have this memory of punk gigs and everything. So it's something that I carry, but I feel that I don't have the power to say that I belong to this culture. However, it's something that as an archive I could say that I carry. So yes, in relation to my practice, there are a lot of contexts that collide and come together and movement-wise affect what I explore.
In a way, maybe it's a wrong thought, but in a way one could say also that in your own choreographies, you kind of like, there's an archive of, for example, the movements in the mosh pit. So the choreography is also a subjective and altered archive of a movement and sound from somewhere else.
Yes, for example, I did this work with the headbanging, which we isolated the practice of headbanging, and we were doing it for 45 minutes. And yeah, this was we somehow used this gesture in order to, with the strategy of repetition and exhaustion choreographically, to allow the imagination to go somewhere else.
I want also, and I want to add on also to the discussion about the archive, but as someone who grew up playing metal music and learning from that world, it was really nice to hear your presentation and resonate with a lot of what you were saying. And I hadn't dissected what the meaning of a mosh pit was until until you took me through it, and it really did feel like that. Metal concerts and mosh pits and headbanging look grotesque from the outside, but once you enter that world, you realize that they're very delicate and tender spaces, actually, that help people grow into communities. But it's interesting to hear these perspectives on the archive, and just to add to that, the work at Earshot looks at this notion of sonic archives as repositories for evidence. There's evidence in these archives, and especially nowadays with the technologies that we have, we are producing huge amounts of evidence without knowing it, and it takes a form of critically engaging with sound to extract the evidence, which not only adds to stories that are put together through the visuals of videos and other forms of evidence, but also tell parallel stories that otherwise would not emerge without the component of sound. So this idea of evidence and archive and unexplored and untapped evidence is something that we find ourselves working with a lot.
I mean, it's interesting, Xenia, when you said about the headbanging, that you isolated the movement, and of course also you isolate sounds, and of course in a lot of acoustic archives. I mean, I once was in the acoustic archive of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, and that's a scary place also, because you have a lot of isolated sounds, acoustics, and so on, and so they went with this early Edison thing there, and recorded sounds, but also made people, of course, tell stories. So there's an uncanny and of course very problematic history. Also, on the other hand, it's also a quite amazing archive. So of course there's this double bind. Already talking about it and analyzing all this, which produces and maybe tell something also about the work you are doing. So somehow isolating and looking at it and analyzing is part of the work, and then how to put it together and is then the question, I guess. But I would maybe open also up to you, because we don't have so much time, so now is the opportunity. We have a microphone, I think, also for the audience, if somebody has a comment or a question.
This beautiful sound of freedom, in a way. It's like a shift to point at the importance of receiving. We have had this activism and a lot of performativity and the focus on the visual and the landscape in the theater, but to attend to the soundscape, also make a shift into the position of receiving. And I think that is very important in question of political potentiality.
You want to react, or that is sent? Is there another comment? Otherwise we continue here, but take your chance. Well, then maybe then we come back to what I was just mentioning before. Do you feel a danger in your work with this isolating and analyzing the work of a researcher in a way, which also has been historically criticized, also to a degree, maybe also as a let's say a colonial practice of understanding things and how to put things together. Is something that plays a role or resonates with your practice in some way? That there might be maybe also a certain kind of violence by looking at certain things and categorizing them and taking them apart.
No, you first.
Okay. Yes. No, first I wanted to just hop back and just say thank you for your comment that I thought was said very beautifully as well. So this is why I think I was unable to respond, because I thought you captured it perfectly. But just to sort of echo back to you that yes, I do think there is a sort of interesting and important political potentiality in these conversations in terms of shifting the focus or reorienting the focus towards acoustic paradigm or a kind of acoustic framework. And that's something that I'm also very motivated by or feel touched by in my own research and practice, to sort of follow the acoustic in that sense. And just to maybe say that, yeah, maybe we can also kind of elaborate a little bit this notion of reception that you shared with us, to think how listening, acoustics, sound may also sort of help us overcome a little bit the sort of logic of the binary. So if we think about passive and active, or acting and receiving, or us and them, self and other, even like knowledge disciplinary regimes in terms of research, you know, the compartmentalization of knowledge that we are very much inheriting and negotiating. I think acoustics and this kind of acoustic paradigm or framework, for me, really kind of helps us shift that logic from the binary to maybe what we could think of as the analogical, or for me, I would even pose the poetic as the basis for a certain kind of thinking and approach to knowledge production that I feel very also attached to and the ways in which acoustics kind of leads us, I think, to also those other frameworks, those other approaches. For me, I find that, yeah, sound, I think for me is a great trafficker in terms of trafficking across boundaries and territories and bodies and environments. This capacity to move across and therefore to stimulate kinds of ways of attuning to things, a kind of like a, maybe we could call it a kind of sympathetic knowledge that allows for thinking or feeling or attending to things outside of the binary. So I think just to share or elaborate a little bit that idea of reception, because I think we could say to ourselves, well, listening, are we receiving or are we acting? Are we doing listening, right? Which I think maybe comes back to your question about the dangers of a certain, approach to research or to the ideas of measurement or compartmentalization. I think for myself, I always find and I always feel quite led by sound and listening in terms of a connector, and even a transgressing connector, to sort of trespass and to maybe create these acoustic spaces where certain cultural identities can mix, certain traditions of knowledge and understanding confront each other and find ways of collaborating. I think this is quite key to a listening position.
Yes, so I also wanted to say thank you, and I'm going to be short because I feel like I talk too much, but there's just a lot of things happening. Just thank you for mentioning that, because I think what I was also trying to get at earlier is that there's a lot of evidence that we need to find still through sound that, like, and I mentioned it before, that we often take the written word, like library books, or, I don't know, just academic journals, all of that as being the first source of knowledge. And we don't sort of think of sound as the first source of knowledge. Or as a main source of knowledge. And I think that there's been a lot of work done, even in South Africa, where people are examining records or albums or things that came out, and that's literally the only evidence that exists of something. There was a festival in Nigeria called Festac in 1977, a Pan-African festival, and there's a publishing house in South Africa called Chimurenga, which I urge you all to check out. It's a Pan-African focused publication. And they put together a big publication based on this festival, just through examining the sound archives of the festival. A lot of albums that came out, a lot of, like the liner notes, like all of the evidence and clues that you put together. So thank you for that. And then also just on the point of sound archives and the colonization or the colonial eye, through the DJ practice that I do, which is something that some people call DJ scholarship, or Lene Denise has created this term, which is essentially the DJ as a scholar, but essentially I think it's a riff off the music journalism and all of that. I think a lot of the music that I play is from the continent as a way to create a Pan-African identity through the DJ sets, as a way to take people through the continent, because of also South Africa was extremely excluded from the rest of the continent. There is a struggle with our own Africanness while being there, because of Dutch colonialism, because of British colonialism, and then apartheid. It's like a triple whammy of removing humanity and identity. And so we're still trying to find, like, where are we now and how do we relate to each other? So one of the things I started doing is collecting what they call library records, which is essentially, or put very crudely, like tribal albums created by, i.e. a kind of sound ethno-musicologist from the 30s or 40s, such as somebody like Hugh Tracy, who had all of the recording equipment, came to certain African rural areas with a truck full of like big reel machines, and recorded certain sounds of the natives, and then put it out on record, and probably got all the liner notes completely wrong because some of the translations are incorrect, or it's just like, here we have a song about the baboon going to the river, you know, it's like insane amount of othering, insane amount of exoticization, and these are some of the what you find in these archives in Berlin. So I have started as a practice to not only collect these albums from across the continent and a bit of Latin America also, but I've decided it's obviously a project that's coming, but I play a lot of these sounds in DJ sets, even sometimes within like club settings, because what I'm trying to get to is to almost get into the process of how these things came about, what ties them together. At the end of the day, as somebody who loves sound, who loves listening and who loves music, we are also happy to have these recordings, you know, to be able to play them, to be able to learn that from Senegal and Gambia, you have this kind of connection. And you know, I'm sitting in the south of the continent, so far away, but if you can hear the same instrument, somehow it moved through. And also that borders are also manufactured. So, you know, like what listening can teach you. So I basically am engaged in an active process of getting these colonizer records. There are lots of German ethnomusicologists, there are lots of British, mostly, that had the capacity to do these recordings. And it's throughout the continent. So that's the one thing I wanted to say, just in terms of the importance of the archive. I didn't bring any of them this time. I'm doing a set, by the way, on Saturday at Astrup Fernley, which is going to be all based on African records, but it's more upbeat, so it's not this kind of archival stuff. But just to say that it's there, and I have a lot of mixes with that stuff. You will find it if you look up my profile. But finally, to say that also as a researcher, just to echo this idea of, I mean, because it leads into what we're going to do now, and I know many of you might be tired and might need to go home, but I urge you to try and stay for a few minutes, because essentially the set I'm doing is a set prepared for listening. It's not a DJ in the sense of, okay, DJ means dance floor. It's a set for the listening sessions that I have been doing as a DJ for the last 10 years. So just in terms of a notion of what you were saying is like the feeling of freedom that comes from just the sound, as opposed to them uttering it very, you know, it's not on the nose, it's not literally being said, but you can hear that all of these albums were recorded in a time where every one of those members were fighting for freedom. So, yeah.
Perhaps just to get back to this idea of the listening, like instead of like talking about listening as kind of a general thing that we all do the same, and to get to the kind of the perspective from who is listening and from what point of view. I was curious, I have a question both to Xenia and to Fabio, perhaps starting with Fabio, like, so you were telling about Earshot and the kind of work that you do, and at the same time we heard your CV, and I was also talking to you about that you are a musician, and people who work at Earshot are artists. I would be interested in how you're being a musician, or you being artists, influences your work, or if it influences. And perhaps to Xenia, is a bit a similar question. You talked about your background in architecture, and I was wondering about the spaces in which you listen, in which the body perceives the music. If there is something beyond the stage pit configuration, if there's something else that you think that shapes the listening experience there.
The background of the arts like music and architecture in myself and in the other people that work at Earshot is extremely useful, because going on to the points that you were making, Atiyyah, and to this notion of evidence, art, as you said yesterday, we talked about this, but you used a great word, art disseminates things into the public and starts a conversation. So on the one hand, you have sound that is often overlooked as a source of evidence, and on the other, you have an audience that, and music is the best example of this, that absorbs all forms of evidence in spite of what the legal system might deem more appropriate or not. So we use this artistic background with Lawrence and with Colleen, with both their different backgrounds, to disseminate these stories while we produce them for legal scrutiny and official scrutiny. We also want them to make their way to the audience. They need that, in fact. It's only half of the process.
According, yes, to your question about architecture and the space, architecture, of course, defines and plays a big role in the way we experience space and we navigate bodily into spaces. So I think that what is interesting in the configuration of the mosh pit is that it happens in, as I said, in this DIY quality spaces. So it kind of has this spontaneity, this authenticity, this no structure, or the spaces that allow a little bit some not so structural things to happen. So, for example, for me, this like this that happens to the microphones when they come together, or to the speakers, or this grain, this suddenly high volume, are some elements that that give another quality to the space and allow movement that it's it's phenomenon. It seems chaotic. However, it's something happening there.
There was a question in the back.
Sorry, I don't really have a question, but I'd like to give a comment. And first of all, thank you for having this event, because all of you have really opened up some new perspectives for me in many different ways. So I really have to go down and home and process a lot of what you've been saying tonight. And I really appreciate it. And also it came to my mind that a hearing or a listening is probably the first sense that we have. We have it even before we're born. And I'm also told that that is the last sense that goes away when we pass over. So listening is key, and sound is also key. And yes, thank you for having these perspectives. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Maybe I would suggest that these are actually perfect last words, much better than I could utter now. Thanks so much for that. Atiyyah already announced that there will be she will play some records outside. So everybody here is warmly invited to stay. If you're listening online now or later in the podcast, you don't have the privilege of having a bodily experience of that. But as we already said, there are some links on the website, so you can perform it at home. Thanks so much for all your thoughts and your inputs. It was really very inspiring also for me, and thanks a lot for listening, and see you outside.